There's a problem with the way we perceive our happiness, our quality of life, our enjoyment, and our overall experience. You can have really high highs and you can have really low lows, and then you can also have a really even, boring life that also averages out to about the same level of enjoyment. And I've started thinking about this as the baseline dilemma. So part of the dilemma is kind of deciding what kind of baseline you want to achieve and how you want to achieve it. You see, most of the time, we think about our experience over time. So the higher we go, the better our experience is, the better our quality of life, and for how long. And most of us kind of think that we go through life like this, and then something bad happens, and then we slowly come back up. And then this line here is our quality of life, is our enjoyment factor, is our whatever you want to call it. When somebody says, hey, do you have a good life? Yes, and you point to that line. But really where the dilemma comes in is that our overall experience is actually the average of the entire experience as a whole. So let me show you it in a different way. If we draw the same graph, our experience over time, and we say that during the week, I have a job that I don't really like, but then I really enjoy my weekends, and then I kind of come back down for the week, and I don't really have much going on, but then something really cool happens, so then I, have a lot of enjoyment, but now I'm going back to work, and so on and so forth. Well, we start to get a baseline average about here. And now sometimes the highs are really high, and then the lows are really low, which kind of creates a baseline that's somewhere in the middle. When you start to reflect on the overall quality of your life, you kind of start to just develop a view of the average of all of your experiences combined. And so a graph like this reminds me of how I used to live my life, where I had a job where I spent most of my time that I didn't really like. At one time I was working at McDonald's and I really just hated it. I didn't like it. It was just a job. It was a way to get money so that I could go do cool stuff. And the cool stuff that I would do was like going to metal shows and going to concerts and throwing myself into a mosh pit and getting the crap kicked out of me and then going and doing it again and again. And that had a high level of enjoyment for me. And those experiences also had a high intensity of enjoyment in themselves. It was a huge, big thing to go to a show. We would spend all day getting ready, like getting to the thing. We would meet up with our friends like first thing in the morning, and it would just be like a heightened experience that really just kind of brought that peak of the experience to a high. And then the show would be over, would kind of like stumble back and kind of like have to recover the next day and kind of just, stumble back into life to go back to the super low of working at McDonald's and having a job where I spent a lot of my time and I didn't really like it. And I think this is kind of a pretty average experience. I lived like this for quite a while. And I would say that as long as I was still having those peak experiences, then the lower experiences of having a job I didn't really like, at the time I didn't really mind it because it was just kind of the way I lived my life. And my baseline experience made me feel like I was doing pretty good even though I spent a lot of time in some pretty low lows. And now if we start to take a look at a different experience on the same graph, maybe now my job, I actually like it a little bit more. And I don't go out and party like I used to. And I just spend kind of a lot of time at work, kind of being like the average. And in this experience, I actually kind of like my job now. So I don't really have a low time where I'm not really enjoying my time because the time I spend in my job is actually enjoyable. Sure, it's hard work and that's why it's a little bit lower. And given the choice, I would much rather spend my time doing other things. And then on the flip side, my peak experiences aren't nearly as high as they used to be. And there's kind of a more even flow with kind of the overall way. So it could be said that my baseline, if we were measuring it, is actually about the same. If we look on the graph, we're right in the middle of these two experiences, and arguably they're pretty similar. And if you ask me what my overall enjoyment of life is, there may be a factor of it being relatively the same answer in both situations. This kind of encapsulates the baseline dilemma, where you can have really high highs and you can have really low lows that even out to a pretty decent enjoyment baseline. And then you can also have a really even kind of like low-key boring life that also averages out to about the same level of enjoyment. So now the real dilemma is knowing that you can have a really even life and you can also have a life with high highs and low lows and get about the same level of enjoyment. Which do you choose? And I think in order to answer that, you also have to answer the question, what are you able to control and what do you want to control? Say, for example, you have a job that you don't like and there's not much you can do about it. The thing is that we've taken the follow your passion culture to a kind of an unhealthy level where having a job that you don't like is totally fine. Like, you don't have to be working a job that you enjoy. You don't have to be working a job that's fulfilling. Sometimes you just have to work a job because you need money to survive, and that's the way that life works. So in those situations, what do you do to raise your baseline enjoyment? And now, to be clear, some people might just be okay with having a lower baseline. Maybe they don't really want a lot of excitement. They just want to kind of have that, so they start to round off some of their experiences and kind of take it more even. And yeah, they have a lower baseline, but that's fine with them. Life can be as exciting as you want it to be, or it doesn't have to be. Don't let anybody tell you different. And so for the vast majority of people, the work in which we do is not necessarily a controllable. It's just kind of a fact that we have a job and maybe we're not super interested in it. Maybe we're not motivated to have a different job. We are motivated to do other things outside of work that are way more interesting. If we look at our controllables from a sense of what kind of inputs can I put into my graph to raise or lower my baseline, I think there's things like in the self-care area. So that would be the food you eat, exercise, sleep, hobbies you do, community you're a part of, and your relationship with your family, just relationships in general. And so when we start to consider these controllables outside of things like work that we may or may not have very much control over, or we may not care to control it in the first place, some of these other things in our life outside of the job that we do can start to have an impact on what those higher experiences look like and start to compensate for some of the lower experiences of life. And of course, work is not the only thing that provides a low on this experience chart. Things like family emergencies or personal emergencies, medical factors, whatever it is that might make your life a little bit more difficult, and those random things that you can't control, all of a sudden you get a flat tire and now you have to deal with that. That sucks, and that's going to bring your experience down to a low point. But some of these other things are ways to start to address that and bring it back up after the situation is dealt with, and you can actually spend time focusing on your upward trajectory. When I was working in landscaping, there was a number of people who lived in Mexico but would come to the United States and work for this company over the peak landscaping months in summer. And if you've never done landscaping, it kind of sucks, at least for me. And I know that a lot of these guys did not really enjoy their experience of work, but it was what it is. And they just had a pretty flatline experience of working a job that was really difficult and demanding, and they didn't really care about it too much. But what it provided for them is that in the winter months, they would go back to Mexico and spend time with their family, not have to work because they made enough money during their time doing landscaping. And now that they're with their family, not having to worry about work for a couple of months, their experience has just risen to a pretty even peak. And now when you look at the whole cycle of what they were doing with their lives, you can see that their baseline is also pretty even. Another example of this is I know somebody who's a carpenter by trade and works really, really hard for a couple of months whenever there's some big jobs and makes a ton of money because he's really good at his craft. And then he takes a couple of months off and just goes and travels around the world. And at any given point, he's somewhere in the world. We're never really sure, but occasionally we hear from him. And so his experience is that he works hard and then he plays hard. And then he works hard, and then he plays hard. But the cycle takes a lot longer to complete than someone who lives for the weekends and hates their job and goes back to the job and lives for the weekends. And ultimately, we'll have a pretty similar baseline, but their cycle looks very different. It might be a weekly or monthly cycle as compared to a full year-long cycle or a 6-month cycle, whatever it looks like for you. So part of the dilemma is kind of deciding what kind of baseline you want to achieve and how you want to achieve it. And also, too, if your life looks like a wild roller coaster ride like this, maybe you do have a baseline and you are happy with that level, but you're tired of climbing up to these high highs and then crashing down to these low lows and coming back up to these high highs. And you kind of want to have just a more even experience of life and kind of flow through your baseline like that. And so let me know in the comments, what does your baseline graph look like? Is it more even? Does it come in seasons? Or do you have kind of the peaks and valleys that a lot of us experience? I'd love to know. I'll see you in the next one.